up? You guys can all see them? That's working? Okay, good. I should tell you a little bit about the project that I'm engaged in here. I gave a talk at the Alice Ambrose Thomas Tomasco Logic Lectures in 2020 by Zoom to Northampton, Massachusetts. And after I gave the talk there about Susan Stebbing, Alice Ambrose, and Ruth Barkin Marcus and their role in shaping and giving us the modern logic that we've got today, I got an email message a couple of weeks later from an undergraduate, a very, very brilliant undergraduate at one of the women's colleges in the US, Mount Holyoke College. And the lady's name is Adelia Brown. I've invited her to this, and I don't know if it's a time is terrible for her, but she and I started, she said to me, do you have, I was interested in this, do you have any kind of a research project where you need an assistant on this kind of a subject? And I said, well, actually, yeah, let's put a project together. And it was in the middle of COVID. And I suggested to her, given that she had been interested in Stebbing and Ambrose and Marcus and their contribution. So that was a much more logic-y talk. And what I have today is much more of a sociological talk, but I have some questions about the logic that I want to get to. When she came to me with this question, it was in the middle of COVID, and I had no possibility of travel to various archives and things. So I said to her, what about an archival project trying to look at how Russellian logic reached the American women's colleges, of which she and I were both, you know, I had been a student at Smith, she was at Mount Holyoke, even is now at the time. And she contacted a lot of archivists around at the Seven Sisters colleges and put together really a amazing bunch of work about it that is tracing the scholars who arrived at the colleges, which ones brought real Russellian logic when, what textbooks they were using, what kinds of requirements there were. And in the midst of all of this, is the puppy too loud in the background? Okay, good. Okay. In the midst of this, one of the things that I came across was the list of members of the, now I'm sorry this is so small, the list of officers and members of the Association of Symbolic Logic from 1936. And I've gone through here, I know they're too small to read them all, but I highlighted in yellow all of the women who were at this. And I just want to show you these couple of, it's 4 pages in total. All right, so you have, I don't know, do you guys get my cursor? I don't know. You get Suzanne Langer, you've got Alice Ambrose on the first page, and a bunch of unfamiliar names. So here's the second 2 pages of it. So more women on pages 3 and 4. So I thought, this is interesting. Who are these women? And I have here made it a little bit more legible. What you find in the meeting in October 1936, 14 women participating, listed as members. Alice Ambrose, who was at the time at Ann Arbor, Michigan, she had left she had already completed 1 PhD at the University of Wisconsin on intuitionist logic, and then gotten a scholarship, gone off to study at Cambridge, where she was working with Wittgenstein until she fell out with him. And this was just after she fell out, 1936, a year later, and she was teaching at Ann Arbor. Marjorie Goldwasser, Martha Hunt, Florence Lamont, Suzanne Langer, Carol McCammon, Virginia Onderdonk. These are not all names that people know. Julia Simpson, Susan Stebbing here at number 9, Marie Swaby, a professor at NYU, Ida, Lucy Van Dyke, Ethel Yeaton, and then 2 more added a month later, Sarah Brown, and Professor Sarah Brown and Professor Marjorie Harris. So I was intrigued about this, that 14 out of 164 members listed in the ASL in 1936 were women. So a little bit more than 8.5% of the membership at the time. And I just thought, I haven't heard of half of these women. Who were they? What kind of logic were they studying? Where'd they come from? My questions here. And did they have careers inside or outside higher education in the US? What did they do, if not? So I want to start off just by giving you, I said this really is a historical sociological project in some ways. I just want to start off introducing you to the whole crowd. And the first, some of them are ones that logicians in particular might know. Suzanne Langer, born Suzanne Katerina Knauth, 1895 in New York. And I've got as much biographical detail as I can just for a simple introduction, but sometimes I haven't really been able to find much information about them at all. But Suzanne Langer is one of our famous ones. Her father was an attorney in New York, and her mother and father both had been born in Germany. Here is a picture of her in, I guess, her later years. Here's a picture of her doing an imitation of Wittgenstein, I think. When she was younger, and a little bit about Suzanne Langer, that her education was Radcliffe, the sister to Harvard, with a BA in 1920, MA 24, and her PhD with Whitehead, all right, in 1926. Get out of there. And she had gone off to do some graduate work as well at Vienna, as one did back in this day. In terms of jobs, she looks pretty impressive. Her story was actually quite sad, that she had these positions at you see Harvard, Radcliffe, up until 1942, even though she had been publishing, which you can see down at the bottom of the screen, some of her more logic-y publications I've given you here. She was not made part of the permanent staff at Radcliffe, and that's why we find her after 1942 moving on to other places, Delaware, Columbia, and then she spent most of her career at Connecticut College, which is, what I've done right through this is bolded in most of their occurrences, I've bolded the women's colleges names. Okay, so Connecticut College was primarily women's college at the time, and then she taught as well at Michigan, NYU, Northwestern. I can't read this because of the way my screen is set up right now. Oh, maybe I can make that. I have you guys with your pictures overlapping. Okay, so Northwestern Ohio, Smith, one of the women's colleges, Vassar at the time, one of the women's colleges, University of Washington, and Wellesley, just outside Boston. So an academic career here, and of course she is she was one of the older ones in this crowd that we're going to be looking at. And as we move on, Alice Ambrose, she is a logician born 1906 in Illinois, and for biographical details, she was orphaned at the age of 13. She went on to Millikan University in I think it's in Illinois, and then went on to the University of Wisconsin, where she did a PhD, as I said, on the on work on violent intuitionism, and she did it with McGilvray there. After that, got a fellowship from Wellesley College, went off to Newnham College at Cambridge, where she, oops, sorry, some typos here, where she came out with the second PhD in 1935, but that was originally, Wittgenstein had been supervising her. She's alleged to have shown up with the copy of the Tractatus tucked under her arm when she arrived from the US and said, great, let's talk. And he said, no, dear, that's passé. We're not doing that now. We're moving on. And she worked with him, and is famous for giving us things like the Blue Book and the Brown Book, or the Yellow Book, whichever names we use. And as a Wittgenstein interpreter and scholar, but she fell out with him in 1935 when she started trying to combine her PhD work on intuitionism and what she had been learning from Wittgenstein. And he had a lot of issues about anybody publishing anything he did. So he certainly didn't like it connected to Weil. And I think she made some gross logical errors. I've given some AAL talks about that before, but this is after all of that. She had fallen out with him, gotten a job here at Michigan, 1935-37. So she was at the ASL coming from Michigan, and then she spent the bulk of her career at Smith College, one of the women's colleges in Northampton, Massachusetts, rising to full professor. Now, about some of the biographical details. She married a fellow philosopher, fellow Wittgenstein student, Morris Lazarowitz. They met in Michigan. They were both teaching in Michigan in 37, and both arrived at Smith together, and then immediately got married from what I know. She is probably equally famous, if not even more famous, for being one half of the Ambrose and Lazarowitz team that wrote the Fundamentals of Symbolic Logic. So she and her husband wrote what for I guess a generation was one of the more influential logic texts, editor of the JSL. and president of the Eastern Division for a while. Okay, now here's somebody you're not going to have heard of, most likely in the context of logic. Marjorie Goldwasser, born 1915. Her parents were described in, I got the stuff from, I didn't put my information about where I got it from. Something like the American Jewish Association had this detail on her, that her parents were secular upper middle class Americans of German Jewish descent. She was not raised Jewish. Her mother was a teacher and activist, and her father had a PhD in education and rose to be public school superintendent and executive director of the New York Jewish Federation. His daughter Marjorie had a pretty equally illustrious career. She was an undergraduate at Bryn Mawr and had also done an MA there in 1936. And it was there, according to everything I found, that she became interested in her Jewish heritage. Now, this gets a bit interesting because I don't know how to pronounce his name. Is he Paul Weiss or Weiss? I don't know. Okay. Well, I'd probably say Weiss more naturally. He had come from Harvard and was teaching at Bryn Mawr 31 to 46, so he was there then. And there had been quite a bit of controversy around his appointment because the department at Bryn Mawr said, we already have a Jew. So in 1931, this was a serious issue. And in fact, it was Grace de Laguna, the professor and chair in the department, who said to hire him. So they got Weiss, and he seems to have had a number of women doing some very sophisticated logic. It looks from what Adelia Brown was finding about the undergraduate women's colleges, it looks like by virtue of having Weiss at Bryn Mawr as early as 31, by 1932, the women at Bryn Mawr were getting the real deal. They were doing Russellian logic in 1932, which seems, from what her research shows, to be the earliest of any of the women's colleges. And then Marjorie went on to the University in exile in the New School in New York. And then her career was not in philosophy and in university education. She became quite famous. She taught a little while at Jewish Theological Seminary, but then through Jewish Theological Seminary became the producer of something called the Eternal Light Show, which was a weekly program introducing Americans to just Judaism and making it less scary, making it accessible and interesting to people. And you look at the dates where she's doing this and realize, you know, how important that a social act that was. But it was an illustrious career. And I've noted she's part of a small contingent from Bryn Mawr that attended the ASL. So it looked like Weiss probably brought some of his students. Now here's one you may or may not recognize. Martha Hearst, born in 1909. Martha Hearst is from Somerville College for her BA, then went to Chapel Hill, apparently hated it and thought that it was the boonies, and shifted up to Bryn Mawr with a fellowship from Bryn Mawr. So she too was working with Weiss. Her career was spent at Oxford at Lady Margaret Hall, and you may recognize her more under her married name, Martha Neal. Okay, this is William Neal's wife. And the two of them did produce the development of logic. She wrote the sections on the pre-Socratics, which are absolutely divine. They're gorgeous, and amazing work of scholarship. But it's not. She wasn't really doing Russellian logic there. It was history of logic that she was working on. But absolutely breathtaking stuff. And somebody who clearly has a bit of the bug for logic. Another thing that's nice to note is that William and Martha Neal, they had two children. One of whom is the philosopher Jane Heel. So one of our women logicians who has a son or daughter who went on to become a philosopher themselves. Another one, I couldn't get you a photograph. Oh yes, I could get you a photograph of this one. Florence Haskell Corliss Lamont. You're probably not going to have heard of her so much. Born in Englewood, New Jersey, 1873, Smith College alum way back in 1893, an MA from Columbia and philosophy. And I had to put this quote in. She was interested in philanthropic activities, especially those related to education and international affairs and peace. She served as a Smith College trustee from 1911 to 25, supported the New School for Social Research, and in 48 donated 150 acres in Palisades, New York, to Columbia University for the establishment of the Center for geography studies, a supporter of the League of Nations and the UN, served on the board for the League of Nations and the executive committee of the American Association for the United Nations until her death. Busy in foreign policy associations, literary circles. Her friends included Robert Frost, John Masefield, H.G. Wells, and in addition to her philanthropic work, she wrote and published stories, poetry, articles, and contributed to the Journal of Philosophy. She traveled frequently in Europe, Asia, and Mexico. And why she's a bit of fun to find included in this bunch is her, in a sense, her great claim to fame was that she married the CEO of J.P. Morgan Bank. And they had 4 children, one of whom, Corliss Lamont, also became a philosopher. And the photograph here that I gave you for advertising the talk is Florence Corliss Lamont giving the deed to the family property in Palisades, it's Torrey Cliffs, to then Columbia University President Dwight Eisenhower. All right, so you don't expect to find, I was a bit blown away when I found this kind of thing among my women logicians at the ASL in 1936. Another lady, Carol V Mccammon. I couldn't find exact dates, I'm guessing at this. Bachelor and master's from Berkeley. She had been a graduate student at Michigan 38-39, but I can't find anything more about her, except that she spent her job teaching mathematics at Coolidge High School in Washington, D.C., in the mathematics department there. But she rose to quite high heights in mathematics education in America, becoming the managing editor of both the arithmetic teacher and mathematics teacher. And some of her publications are fascinating. The last one that I've got listed there, Developing a Citywide Algebra Test, is actually looking at the very kinds of things that we have people talking about today, where we have social inequity and income inequities. How do we accommodate, and what do we do when we are looking at standardized assessment? So, she rose to be quite a power in her field. Now, here's somebody probably most haven't heard of. Virginia Onderdonk, again, is a very well-connected American lady, photograph over here in middle age. But why she's important, and she actually turns out to be one of the very important ones in the story, is that she is yet another who has some experience of real proper Cambridge training, Cambridge University, not Cambridge, Boston. Although she came from Wellesley College as an undergraduate, one of the women's colleges, went to Chicago for a bit. It's not clear. I have not been able to trace down what she was actually up to there. And then after she had been hired at Wellesley College teaching, and she was teaching the logic courses there, by 1937, she took off to go to Cambridge, where she stayed at Newnham College. It was when Wittgenstein was in Norway. So she wouldn't have connected with him personally there, but she came back. And as soon as she got back in 1938, Wellesley College girls were doing Russellian logic from that point on, that she brought Russellian logic into the teaching from 1938, immediately after that trip to Cambridge. So maybe something in the air there that picked that up. She doesn't seem to have published very much, but she's an interesting source of information about the goings on, because she wrote a very thorough history of Wellesley College, which tells you a bit about the kind of politicking they had to do to launch the college and to keep things thriving. A lady I haven't been able to find much about at all, Julia Simpson. She lived in Park Slope in Brooklyn, immediately in a beautiful apartment building that was built as an apartment building, immediately opposite the entrance to Prospect Park. And I put my mother and all of her old New York and Brooklyn friends onto this, trying to find, I've got all of these 80-year-old archivists who are hunting down information for me, finding what we can. And they were able to find that she had gone to Hunter College, which is what this was the primary place where New York would send its bright women to train them to be teachers. And she was got honors or honorable mention in mathematics there, and then went on to teach for the rest of her life, as far as I can tell, at Germantown High School. But there are lots of Germantown high schools, and I can't find which one. Archivists, I think, are overloaded COVID and what we're going through. So I don't have a whole lot of information about her, but she would have been pretty well off if she was living immediately opposite the entrance to Prospect Park. Susan Stebbing, a name that many people will know, born 1885, so one of our older ones here. Came from Girton College at Cambridge and had an MA from King's. And actually, I've kind of highlighted the wrong things here. There's a reason why I've got the yellow highlighting. I've actually found 3 of these women at this Eastern Division conference at Yale in 1931 giving talks. But Stebbing is famous for her, in logic, famous for the 1930 text, A Modern Introduction to Logic, which was written for the British university examinations to help the students prepare for the university exams. But the exams when she wrote this were still the old traditional syllogistic logic, and Stebbing snuck in the modern stuff, saying that anybody who's learning logic today in Britain needs to know all of this new stuff. So she updated it. So it's a modern introduction to logic. And under the employment, these are some important things about her, particularly the second one. She became the first full professor who was female in philosophy in the UK at Bedford College. And there was some careful backroom trading and deals to make sure that that worked. She was passed over for a very senior position at one stage where they hired a man. I can't remember if he walked off or just died. And then they did some very serious horse trading to make sure that the professor of psychology was a woman, Beatrice Edgell, who made sure that Susan Stebbing was made the new professor and the first professor, full professor of philosophy who was female in the UK. But she's one of our famous ones. I'm not gonna dwell on her too much. Professor Marie Swaby, I have not been able to find as much as you'd think, given that she is a professor at NYU, but born 1890. So again, one of my older ones. Undergraduate BA was Wellesley, then to Kansas, then to Cornell. And she's another one who married a philosopher, William Curtis Swaby, and their careers were at NYU. And she's again one of the ones who gave, one of the threesome who gave a talk at the Eastern Division in 1931 on Is There Logical Force in Demonstration? Ida Lucy Van Dyke. She was a bit of a surprise. Born in 1907 to a, again, very, very wealthy old establishment New York family. Hers is the kind of old establishment family for whom the Bronx were named after. And she's a descendant of Jonas Bronx, for whom the Bronx in New York is named after. The Van Dykes themselves were also very well known. And one of her other ancestors, Peter Brock, I loved this bit, in 1661, this tells you what kind of old American wealth we're talking, the real old Dutch New York. He bought the land on the Hudson River in 1661 that became Coxsackie, New York, and he paid the American Indians for the land in, I think they said it was 150 beaver pelts. Okay, so this was real starting off in New York. She was from Barnard College, which is the women's college associated with Columbia University, went on to Brown and was there in 1932 and attended the American Mathematical Society's council meeting as a nominee of the National Life Insurance Company of the United States of America. And she was one of 3 women in attendance at that American Mathematical Association meeting. But she went on to become a Presbyterian minister. And just for fun social details, part of the fun of this project is that I get to spend a lot of my time reading through the New York Times bridal section to find out the kind of details I need. At the age of 59, she became a society bride and was in the New York Times bridal section when she married John Hordines in 1966. But it was, not a career in logic. It was a Presbyterian. Now, Professor Ethel K. Yeaton, I had too much coffee this morning, born in 1883, one of my very oldest in this group. Undergraduate degree was Oberlin in 1906 and Chicago, PhD in 1914. Was employed at Oberlin from around 1906 and finally retired as a professor in 1935. What did I find her here? Giving a talk about nature and the social object, and was the only woman at the conference, the Ohio College Association, only woman presenting. I couldn't find a picture of her, but I found a picture of the house that she and her husband lived in Oberlin, Ohio. and Professor Sarah Brown. I can't believe I'm having so much trouble finding details about a professor from Wells College, one of the women's colleges in New York. But my appeals to the archivists haven't turned any details up yet. But she was a professor and in 1936, and in 1931 was another one of the threesome giving talks at the Eastern Division. Don't know enough about how much she was actually doing in logic, though. She's a bit hard to track down. Marjorie Harris, 1890, so again, the older crowd, Mount Holyoke BA in 1913, PhD 1921 with the Susan Lynn Sage Scholarship from Cornell. Was teaching for a while in Colorado, and then spent the rest of her career at Randolph-Macon's Women's College, finally retiring, or she was, yeah, until 58. She retired in 58. But her work is not really so logic-y when you look at even the topics there. So just taking this little bit of an introduction to these ladies, some of the interesting statistics that come into it. Two of them went on to careers in mathematics as high school teachers, which isn't entirely surprising if they're at the ASL as students in 36, Carol McCammon and Julia Simpson. I could probably have included, if I did this slightly differently and not by careers, Ida Lucy Van Dyke was another of the mathematicians, but two of them found careers in religion, Marjorie Goldwasser at Jewish Theological Institute and the Reverend Ida Lucy Van Dyke in the Presbyterian Church. This was interesting. 9 out of the 14 women there in 1936 found careers in undergraduate or university teaching positions. Suzanne Langer, most of her career at Connecticut College, Alice Ambrose at Smith College, Martha Neal at Lady Margaret Hall, Oxford, Onderdonk at Wellesley, Stebbing, Bedford, the Women's College at London, Marie Swaby at NYU, Ethel Yeaton, Oberlin, Sarah Brown at Wells, Marjorie Harris at Randolph-Macon. 3 of the 14 women married other philosophers. So you've got Ambrose and Lazarowitz and Marie and William Swaby at NYU, Martha Hearst and William Neal at Oxford. 2 of them had children who became philosophers. Florence Lamont had the Corliss Lamont, her son, and Martha Hearst, whose daughter is Jane Neal. And then I've got my oddball philanthropist in here. So there are, I wanted to look at this, try to say, what can I draw out of it, and what kinds of questions do their biographies, their histories leave us with? And I should explain a little bit that there had been some background setting up, that the meeting itself was not, in fact, the very first meeting of the ASL. There had been some informal meetings before that. Interestingly, Suzanne Langer seems to have been in on all but one of those very, very early meetings. So she was included and known in this circle during the initial setting up. By the time they were really starting to get formally organized, everybody in America, and there were others coming from Britain and other places as well. They knew that there was going to be a lot of interest in having a journal of symbolic logic. And that had actually been set up, but they had begun to do the foundations for that. But they were actually quite worried. They knew there was a need for it because the philosophy journals either did not like, in some cases, or in most cases would not have had the technical facility for printing logic articles. And then if you thought, well, we'll go to the math journals didn't like the philosophical spirit in the philosophical logicians' work. So there was a need recognized in the around 1934, 35, 36, there were discussions, and finally the JSL is established. And their big concern was that this was going to be very, very expensive. How are we going to do it? So they sought support. Now, this is probably how people like Florence Corliss Lamont would have gotten in on anything anyway, from the sounds of it, because it was her kind of philanthropy. But in volume 1, number 1 of the JSL, March 36, you hear the kind of plea that they make. Continuation of the publication of the journal is wholly dependent on the support it receives. Those who are desirous of aiding the enterprise, whether themselves workers in the field or not, are invited to apply for membership in the association, and if possible, for contributing or sustaining membership. So they were making open pleas for support, and they were getting it from quite a number of the universities that The universities were, some of them were quite quick to get behind it. But how on earth did these women end up at the ASL meeting? Langer, I said, was part of it from the very early days. Bryn Mawr with Paul Weiss there, and also a real mover and shaker in Grace de Laguna as the chair of the philosophy department, appears to have sent Weiss and a couple of his students, Martha Hearst and Marjorie Goldwasser. Makes sense. I've said here, wild horses would not have kept Florence Lamont, Alice Ambrose, or Virginia Onderdonk away. By 36, I wonder if it was in fact this, there's something that hints to me that it may have been the ASL meeting itself in 1936 that prompted Virginia Onderdonk to go off to Cambridge and then come back with the Russellian logic that she just immediately introduced into the curriculum. Ambrose was a bit of an old hand by this stage. She had the 2 PhDs and was teaching at Michigan, so found her way to it and was on her way in 1930, no, maybe not quite on her way to the job at Smith. I don't know that, I think that may have come just a little bit later. And then it's exactly the sort of thing that our philanthropist, Florence Lamont, would have jumped onto. Whoops, sorry. But then there were those 4 senior professors, that older generation who were professors, Marie Swaby, Ethel Eaton, Sarah Brown, Marjorie Harris. And they're showing up at the ASL meeting in 36 is like any of the women professors at UQ showing up at the AAP if they're going to start a new subgroup in something that we're interested in. So those guys make perfect sense. They belonged there. And then the mathematicians found their way to it. McCammon, Simpson, both mathematicians, and Ida Lucy Van Dyke, the minister herself, was a mathematician and giving talks around at conferences. So they probably did know each other even before they arrived at the 1936 meeting. Certainly the ones from the Eastern Division in 1931 giving the talks will have met at that. But there were very strong allegiances and support systems between the various women's colleges. There were the original Seven Sisters and quite a number of others. And remember too, in the post, the Victorian age that led to the establishment of a lot of these women's colleges, the Victorian men were very often very strident feminists. So there was a lot of support for the women's colleges and keeping them modern. They did not want them to be, they didn't always, Harvard had attitudes. There were places in these early days where they didn't see it as on a par with the men's education, but by and large, the attitude in America at the time was, no, this needs to be providing as much and as good for our daughters as for our sons. If the son was going to go to Yale, the daughter would go to Smith. If the son went to Harvard, the daughter would go to Wellesley, and so on. And there were those allegiances right the way through. But I'm now starting to get to a little bit more of the speculative. I mean, that's my historical background, and where do you go with this kind of information? When you are talking about women in the history of philosophy, people almost invariably begin to talk about how the history of women in philosophy is written in disappearing ink. It's an expression from one of my old professors at UMass Amherst, Eileen O'Neill, who wrote an article called Disappearing Ink, explaining that what was going on. And she was a specialist in 17th century, 18th century philosophers and tracing the work of those earlier women. But that point, the label still holds. It still comes up when you're talking about 20th century logicians like I am here. And the question is, did they get written out? There is typically an assumption that they do. Quiet. One of them I've got here, and I put this in because I need help with this one. I found this about Suzanne Langer. By any measure of academic achievement, hers was an exceptionally distinguished career in philosophy with regard to both teaching and scholarship. Yet surprisingly, her voluminous written work, pioneering and evocative in many respects, has been fairly neglected in professional circles. It must also be recalled that Langer was a woman, indeed a divorced woman, working in a male-dominated field during the time. By all accounts, she was supremely self-assured and forthright, and her intellectual mastery and originality was the equal of any 20th century philosopher. This is by somebody named Hart. I found it on the web with no references. And if anybody can tell me who Hart might be, I would be very grateful. I have not been able to trace this down, but I put it in partly because I needed help with that. But it's an example of the kind of comments that you do frequently find. And I'm puzzled about that, partly because I grew up with a different lore about women's contributions as an undergraduate at a women's college where Alice Ambrose Lazarowitz had been teaching. We grew up with completely different stories and not a sense that women were written out or not included. So that's part of my interest in this, is trying to get to the bottom of this. Were they written out of the history? Now, I don't think that there's a really clear that answer needs to be careful. We can't say that somebody like Susan Stebbing or Alice Ambrose was written out. You certainly can't say just a few years later Ruth Marcus was written out. These are women who did help to set a new standard, as I've said here, set a new agenda. They were helping to modernize logic. A lot of what the women were doing, which is interesting, is that I've always said you can't really teach an undergraduate logic from Principia Mathematica. And the women seem to have been the ones who recognized that immediately, picked it up and said, right, we have to teach, we have to get this across to people. So they set themselves up in many respects, several of them as interpreters of the new modern mathematical symbolic logic. And in doing so, I've given a talk about this, so I won't go into it too much, but they make little contributions, modernizing it in little steps, modernizing, bringing Russellian logic to bear on traditional syllogistic. You find Stebbing doing something like that. Ambrose brings Wittgensteinian truth tables into the teaching of modern symbolic logic in Ambrose and Lazarowitz. So they're not just interpreters and writing textbooks. They're interpreters who are contributing. So I don't think that we can fairly say that threesome, and I'm sneaking Marcus in there as well. She is a bit younger. She wasn't at this. She probably could have been in 36. Yes, she could have been, because she was born in, no, she had been a bit young. She was born in 21. But the women I'm talking about, their work has really been picked up and canonized and is included in it. So I've said here that it's so fully incorporated that when we're doing logic, we don't stop and think about them, right? We're just doing logic. We're not stopping thinking, oh, this came from Ambrose or this came from Stebbing or Marcus, that it's just doing logic today. But that's not what anybody means when they're talking about disappearing ink. That they've not been superseded. They've just been so thoroughly incorporated that it doesn't make sense to say that their histories have been written in disappearing ink. But there are ways in which some of the women may have been written out. Now, I've said here too, but there are all sorts of things. If you went off into mathematics, you're not going to be included in the history of the development of logic necessarily after Principia, right? Where this is the disciplines are starting to separate a little bit. A little bit more as this is developing. But one of the things that does come up that may have contributed to women who would be working in logic, au fait with logic, but not being included in the history, is the history of code breaking. And now my focus in this, just for control of it, is really on just the American women because of the project with Adelia Brown. But there were code breaking projects in Britain as well, obviously, right? The very famous ones, but there were less famously, perhaps, programs in code breaking at several of the American women's colleges. The Navy looked and said, we've got to send the men off to fight. We need intelligent people who can do the code breaking. And they sent folks out and a very careful network that recruited young women. And there were big programs at Smith College and at Mount Holyoke College, several other places as well. But what's interesting is this information is only just becoming available. There were a lot of it was embargoed until quite recently. There are now books out on the code breaking girls and things, but it looks like if you really want to get into the details, you're going to have to get into the archives and look at the original stuff. I haven't been able to do that, but what I have been a bit surprised about is that I'm not finding women logicians recruited among the code breakers. Alice Ambrose Lazarowitz was not. There were 6 people on the Smith campus, they say, who were aware of the code breaking project. And you think you've got a woman logician trained by Wittgenstein and the PhD on intuitionist logic. Don't you want her? They didn't. It doesn't sound like she had any involvement in it. It was people in things like botany and biology who had enough mathematical background, and they recruited the girls. Sometimes you'd get a note in your mailbox saying, shh, don't tell anybody, but come and meet behind the squash courts at 11 a.m. on Sunday morning, but don't tell anybody about it. It's government secret. And you get these 19, 20-year-old girls who go, oh, cool, this sounds neat. And they'd show up, and you get today the 90-year-olds telling you about the fun and the excitement there was about it. Some of the professors at the colleges were asked to select girls and shoulder tap. Other times, the way they got them was these questionnaires that were asking things like, do you like solving puzzles? Do you like patterns? Do you like finding patterns or working with patterns? It makes it sound like, you know, the cross stitch club, but they got these women to, if you answered yes, then the next question immediately was, are you planning to get married? And if the answer to that was no, you would get about 12 weeks of training in cryptanalysis, is what they called it back then, not code breaking, but cryptanalysis. And after you did that, you were qualified to take a job in the Navy. But there were huge code breaking teams. The girls were very deeply involved in it. It sounds like it was hundreds of women, if not thousands of women. I don't know the numbers yet. But this is maybe something that features into the history here. That one, the officials, the government, the Navy were looking for a certain sort. All right, this would have happened. They started the code breaking within weeks of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And they were going to be very careful about who they wanted. They did not want Jews. They didn't want communists. They didn't want socialists. They didn't want anybody with a foreign sounding name. So nobody from NYU. No way. Right. Nobody from the New School for Social Research. That's even further off the charts. Nobody with a name like Goldwasser, nobody with a name like Lazarowitz, right? No Barkin Marcus. Lazarowitz sounds foreign, and Goldwasser and Barkin Marcus are very clearly identified as Jewish background. So they wouldn't have been picked. It was too closely linked to socialism, communism, and other governments. There was no way they were going to find those women for these projects. So when Smith had this program going, Alice Ambrose Lazarowitz probably didn't know about it. I don't know that, but my guess is she didn't even know about it. They said only 6 people did. And another reason why the women who might have had logic-y minds and gone on and the stuff have been written out would be simply the fact that this was so classified for such a long time. And the reports are not just that they were sworn to secrecy, but it was on penalty of death, and they took it very seriously. So they were never included in history. But one puzzle that needs to be worked out by going through archives and looking is, were there women philosophers during code breaking? And it's and logicians doing it. And it's actually quite interesting to look at it in terms of the women, because we know, my first comment up there, I should have said it first, the first point on the slide. We didn't just have male logicians doing code breaking. We had male ordinary language philosophers doing code breaking. So you think if they had a crowd of women who had that kind of mind, weren't they included? But it does look like the sociological goings on, the political goings on, probably meant that those women were not included in the cryptanalysis programs. But the second, that was my first major issue that I was mentioning in this contest. The second one is just the huge social upheaval in America. If you think of this meeting that I'm talking about, 1936, and think of everything that came afterwards, America and the world were in a state of social turmoil and upheaval. You had the Depression in the 29 and 30s, which did affect people's access to university. You had World War II immediately after this ASL meeting, and then you had the Cold War. And the McCarthyist era and all sorts of politics. And this is where, okay, now this is where I'm starting to get to the kinds of questions that I've got about this. Clearly, these social issues and the upheaval affected women because it affected education, it affected society at large. But you want to know, well, how did it affect the women? And Virginia Onderdonk, one of our women at the ASL meeting in 36, who was the one who introduced Russellian logic in 1938 at Wellesley College, in her history of Wellesley wrote, "We do know that in certain periods it has been difficult to find qualified women because of decline. between 1930 and the 1960s in the number of women in relation to the number of men who prepared themselves for college teaching by earning PhD degree. Now, that tells you a couple of things. One, the undergraduate women's colleges wanted PhDs on their staff, and they very definitely wanted to hire women. But and she's just talking generally here about academics, not specifically philosophers or certainly not specifically logicians, but there was just a dearth of women. And when you look at that 30 to 1960s, she is describing an entire generation, a 30-year gap between the crowd that we're looking at in the ASL meeting in 1936 and the next really large cohort of women PhDs generally and women PhDs in philosophy. So what is responsible for the changes? All right. Now, this is where I do start to get speculative. A lot of what I have been reading, my husband, Max Creswell, and my friend Ed Mayers, a colleague down at Victoria University, Wellington, the three of us have been working on a project looking at the ways in which ideology generally has affected logic, in particular, the development of modern symbolic logic. And there are a couple of books and articles that have turned out to be really, really interesting in this. One of them is by, well, two of them are by a man named Bruce Cooklick, who's an emeritus professor at UPenn, who had philosophy training and history training. And a lot of what I started to just guess, I found him articulating far better than I ever could. A story about the really almost the pendulum swings in academia and in philosophy specifically. He's got a book on the rise of philosophy in America, which is not really just the rise of philosophy in America, it's the rise of philosophy specifically at Harvard University. And one of the endearing details of the book is that he religiously refers to Cambridge, meaning Cambridge, America, not Cambridge, England, right through the book, which is that Harvard sensibility there. But part of why I found myself sensitive to what he's saying is this, that in part of the work that Max and Ed and I have been doing, we have been off interviewing well, we were interviewing crowds of 80 and 90-year-olds over the past couple of years. Before COVID hit, we were very seriously interviewing, and we were asking people who had studied logic at Cambridge or at Oxford in the dawn, the early years of modern Russellian logic, what it was like. When did it reach Oxford, for instance? It came from Cambridge, and there was some serious resistance to it in the form of ordinary language philosophy at Oxford. And you get that Cambridge-Oxford divide. And a lot of the folks that we were interviewing spoke about the importance of that difference in people's minds when they were students at Cambridge and Oxford, that in the 1910s to 1930s, early 1940s, they described a view of Oxford as the place for training to be a civil servant. And a number of people just used that very expression. That was how they saw it, as opposed to Cambridge, which they considered to be training the scientists. And if you consider that as if you're talking pendulum swings and a bit of a tension between them, that looks like it sets the stage for not just the next couple of decades, but it looks like it may set the stage for the 20th century. And this is what I wanted to talk to you all about, ask for a little bit of guidance and help. When you move on to America and the arrival of modern symbolic logic there, I've said 1920s, but really 1918 with C.I. Lewis, obviously, and his work on the strict implication when he was still at Berkeley, and then he went back to Harvard where he'd come from. But there was a divide that you read about in Bruce Cooklick's book on Harvard, The Rise of Philosophy in America, that describes a tension within the Harvard department itself between the humanists and the ones that we would call they would call them the empiricists. That here it was again a tension modeling what was in Britain, where there was a civic role model. In America, it would have come with more of the sense of how Harvard was meant to be training the ministers to go. There was an old legacy in most of the really old American universities that you were training ministers, and if not ministers, ministers' wives. So there was a sense of that kind of moral compass that philosophy should be providing to wider society. And they found themselves in the 20s and 30s in a bit of tension with the logicians, because they did have C.I. Lewis, and he was a pretty good logician, and they started to hire others, and eventually even brought in A.N. Whitehead in the 30s. I think it was at 34, I think, that they brought him over to try to beef up Harvard's public image, that Russell himself was too dangerous, right? That his politics were not kosher in America in the day, whereas Whitehead seemed to be that much more reserved and suited to exactly what Harvard thought that it needed, and they were absolutely thrilled to have him. And he was supervising other younger logicians, but he was working more on other aspects of philosophy than the logic when he'd gotten to Harvard. When you move to Harvard's younger cousin, Yale, which is really an early offshoot of it, you find there, and this is a department that in my youth was always described as the most fiercely riven between what I've called it here humanist empiricist, still trying to reflect the labels up above on the handout, between a crowd that saw itself as having a pluralist orientation and rejecting the technicians. And they did have good real logicians there, and in fact they ended up with Ruth Marcus for part of her career, who Anderson was there, Belknap was there. They had a huge, they had, and Fitch, of course, who was a Yale man himself and spent his career there. So they had their logicians, but Yale was unhappy about that and always unsettled by it. And the tensions at Yale, in some things that you read and hear, and some of the lore that you grow up with in America, is even that the analytic continental distinction is something that grew out of the humanist empiricist pluralist versus technician picture that I'm describing here. That I'm not sure if that's quite true, but some things have hinted that the whole analytic continental divide is not really, when you think of it with the fierce tension, it wasn't something between Britain and the continent, but it's something that grew out of Yale. I don't know whether I put that forward, but some places seem to suggest something like that. But when you compare these early years, and I'm including Yale here in the early years, by the time we get to the mid-century, we just have such a whole new world, enormous change. You've got the civil rights movement, you've got the anti-war protests, student rebellions, all sorts of social unrest, and you've got feminism. And I picked on this because part of what I started to wonder is, how much does this have to do with women, that if you take what Virginia Onderdonk describes as that 30-year gap where there had been women doing advanced PhDs, and I've given you a slew of them in this crowd of 14 women who went on to do PhDs, and many of whom were doing the PhDs in the logic of the time, not necessarily in the modern symbolic logic, given where they were, but they were shush. They were familiar with it. That's a very naughty puppy in the background. Sorry. But how much did this social change have to do with it? And here's evidence of why we might think it might be important. I've picked this from Andrea Nye's book, Words of Power, which is a grump against analytic philosophy that she encountered at Harvard when she was an undergraduate. I think it was 1961 that she showed up there. And the poor thing ended up in Quine's logic course, okay? But here's what she says: advances in logic depend upon thought only, unrelated to any personal, political, or economic considerations. Marital conflict, poverty, war might keep the logician from his desk, but once there, he puts family disputes, politics, and economic hardships aside and engages in a purely intellectual activity. And this is right from the very opening of her book. And the whole book is filled with this. Now, when those in the audience who are logicians will probably be sitting there nodding your head saying, yeah, that's logic. That's what we do. That part of what a logician loves often about logic is that it affords you, Arthur Pryor called it a certain agnosticism, that you don't have to be wrapped up in the dirty world. You can contemplate these higher truths and avoid sometimes what is scary politics. But when Adriane says this, she doesn't mean it in any kind of complimentary way. Most logicians probably see this as something that, yeah, we recognize that about our discipline, that it is often at a bit of a remove, and there's some comfort in that sometimes. And Arthur Pryor certainly found some comfort in it. But she doesn't mean that here. She means this as very, very fierce criticism, that we have a call to do the civil servant side, provide the civic role models, to embrace the pluralism. And if I can treat her as just one example of what might have been going on, if you had been a girl in 1920 at university, 1935, 1938, all of a sudden there is, and even 32 or 34, when Paul Weiss got to Bryn Mawr, there was Russellian symbolic logic at Bryn Mawr, 38 at Smith College and at Wellesley. It was there. If you met that stuff, you would you find a career path in it? Was it just part of an MRS degree? What was it doing there? And the difficulty is, if you were one of those young women doing the logic, probably in those early ages, the only possibility would have been to go on to the PhD and be one of the women that Virginia Onderdonk said the colleges were looking for, needing to hire new staff. And certainly the logic was taking off. But if you think of an entire generation between 1930 and the 1960s that were not going on, by the time that next cohort was in university, even if there was logic, and even if the rest of the university was opening up more to women and social concerns, you weren't going to find women professors by the 1960s. My crowd had retired by then. They were out. They would have been part of college law for the most part. So the younger women in the 1960s were not going to find professors of logic who were teaching it. And the world had changed. That it sounds as though the social changes may have pulled women to these other fields, like today the social justice movement is pulling students in, but it may have also driven them out of logic. It may have made it a little bit less accessible than it was to the crowd that was at this 1936 meeting. Now, part of the next step in this, and as I said, I have my speculative side to this talk. I've been trying, and I haven't been able to pull it together completely, but to try to put together a timeline, just starting off looking at the United States and Britain, which launched all of this. It does look as though there may be some truth to the idea that the generational swings between the advent of symbolic logic as something accessible, not just to, but just generally, right, to everybody, and then reaching women by the 1930s, right, early to mid 1930s, that was starting to become accessible to more and more women, and certainly to women in Britain who could study with Russell and Wittgenstein at Cambridge. But it does look as though, and certainly if you follow Kuklik and a fellow named Gorska, I think I've got his name right, telling this American history, they do seem to set the stage. They're not looking at logic, and they're not looking at women, but they do seem to be setting a stage that indicates that these generational swings between, are we humanists or are we scientists, come up in their own language every 25, 30 years, and that the goalposts shift. And if that's the case, it does make me wonder if the social changes and the call to step up to solve the social problems in a world that has been through World War I, the Depression, World War II, the Cold War, and now the civil rights movement in America and the student rebellions, all of this, is it now that the greater call on the intelligent young women, certainly, my mother's generation, they, even if they had my grandmother's generation would have had the training I'm talking about. My mother's generation would not. More of them went off and got married, post-war era. And you think about the changes in the education in around the world. America went through the Sputnik era after 1957 that Sputnik was launched. Every child was told, you have to learn your math, you have to do this, we need these kinds of scientists. And it looks as though we can begin to trace a story where the birth of symbolic logic is one of those moments that sets a new agenda. That the social rights movement, civil rights movement, seems to possibly have been one of those that, and yet there's a tension there because the civil rights movement, the anti-war protest, student rebellions, the feminism were coming into their own really in the 1960s at exactly the same kind of time that that Sputnik push was happening. So it may be that it wasn't that any particular one was winning then, but it may have been, when you look at something like logic, that all of this just contrives to send fewer women, the history I'm telling us, right? The fewer women into logic and into logic careers, where the growth of feminism would have had a greater pull with the social agenda, perhaps, than the idea that the work in logic was somehow related. That may have been a disconnect as well if there was a disconnect in the cryptanalysis from the logic, that if those had not been meshed and thought of as going together, there may have been a further setback there. But I'm at a stage where what I'm trying to do is produce a kind of a timeline to test this and see, when you really do flesh out a timeline, can we say that it does make sense that the social changes and things may have led to the turning tide away from logic? We already know the women weren't going on in such numbers through that middle generation in the 40s, 50s, and early 60s. But I have talked about this to my husband, who grew up an older generation in New Zealand. And one of the things that he says is that there would be very big differences in what I'm describing in America and New Zealand, in part because in America, particularly the technical side of philosophy's education in the early 20th century was beginning to develop a notion that we needed to be more than just the ministers, and more than just the conscience guidance and social guidance in society, that there was the technical side of the discipline as well, and that technical side of it required a certain initiation in the symbolic language. So it was beyond the reach of people who were not, initiates themselves. And that did mean that in America, there was much more of a sense from the early days in the 20s and 30s, and Cooklick details this in his book, about philosophy as something that was professional area, that there was the professionalization of the discipline. And Max has been quite adamant with me that there was nothing like that in New Zealand, that education, higher education and a PhD was no guarantee for any kind of a job, that they didn't see it that way. But it does raise questions. I am looking at this stage really just at the US and what I'm presenting to you, but I am very conscious that the questions about the role of women in logic, its accessibility, is something that's far wider. I've listed here, can you guys tell me about Australia? Were you guys sending your student exams off to Britain to be assessed like we were? And would the students have to have learned their logic from Susan Stebbing for the exams in the 1930s? New Zealand was doing that. The UK has its own story and its own code breaking and so on. Canada would be interesting as well. And then when you get outside the Anglophone world, you get interesting crowds where, if you're looking at women logicians, there was the Warsaw Lvov School with Twardowski and quite a number of women logicians. And in former Iron Curtain countries, it doesn't sound as though they had the same kind of pendulum swing back and forth, that it sounds as though the women logicians are much more integrated into philosophy generally. So it's trying to, where I'm at with this is you can see it's sociological background, but I am very interested, kind of desperate, to try to be able to fill in, to begin to say, can we give a mapping that does give a hint either way about whether or not things like the growth of feminism and its arrival as a discipline within universities didn't start to almost exacerbate the kind of divide that the men were already encountering it with the Cambridge Oxford divide, the divide within Harvard, and then the hideous fights within Yale. So it's wanting to put this to all of you and say, can you help me fill in any details? Does it turn into a plausible story? But it just, fascinating to look and see how many of the women in 1936 did go on. I'll go back to that slide, who did go on for their I don't have it on a single slide. Oh, I thought I did that. I'm sorry. But a huge number of these ladies did go on for PhDs in logic or philosophy at any rate, and seem most of them to have been fully behind the idea of setting up the Journal of Symbolic Logic and setting up the Association of Symbolic Logic. So I will stop so I don't start babbling and invite questions. Okay.